The widow was forced into marriage until a stranger stopped the wedding. The supper table had never looked so bare. Clara Mae stared at the chipped plates, her hands trembling as she divided half a loaf of bread between her two children. Dust slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, carried on the sigh of the prairie wind, making the lantern flame flicker. She swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady for the sake of the little ones, though inside her heart felt like it was caving in. "Eat slow," she whispered, sliding the larger piece toward her son Jacob, only 8 but already too thin for his age. Little Annie, just 6, pressed her lips to the bread as if it were a feast. They had been without John, her husband, for near a year now. Consumption had taken him, swept him away like smoke in the wind. Since then, Clara Mae had tried to keep their farm alive, tried to mend fences, tried to coax corn from the dry earth. But the land had turned against her, just as the town had. Every creak of her cabin floor reminded her that she was one misfortune away from losing it all. On Sundays, she still walked with her children into town for church, their best clothes brushed and patched, her chin lifted. Yet she could hear the whispers of women behind their fans. "Poor Clara Mae, won't last another winter alone." Men, too, cast their eyes her way, not with kindness, but with hunger, with calculation. A widow was as vulnerable as an unguarded claim. Her late husband's rifle leaned uselessly by the door. She had fired it once since he passed, missing the coyote that took their last chicken. Since then, she had relied on grit and prayer. But grit did not plow fields, and prayer did not pay debts. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Clara Mae stepped out onto the porch. The prairie stretched wide and merciless under a sky filled with stars. She hugged her shawl tight and whispered to the dark, "Lord, give me strength, just enough to keep them safe." The night answered only with the cry of a distant coyote. In the town, trouble was already stirring. Sheriff Dalton, a man with iron in his voice and greed in his eyes, had been watching Clara Mae's land. He knew she had no kin near enough to stand for her. He knew hunger was her enemy, and loneliness her chain. Soon his boots would echo on her porch, carrying the weight of a demand no woman should ever have to face. But for now, Clara Mae stood. In silence, a mother fighting against the emptiness of the plains, unaware that the battle for her freedom was about to begin. Sheriff Dalton came calling the next morning, the ground trembling faintly with each stomp of his polished boots on her porch. Clara Mae stiffened as his shadow fell across her doorway. The children huddled in the corner, their play cut short, for they knew the sound of that voice, smooth as oil, heavy as iron. "Clara Mae," Dalton drawled, sweeping his hat from his head and letting his pale eyes roam the cabin like he already owned it. "It's a shame, a young widow struggling this way. Ain't fit for a lady to break her back over a farm." Clara clutched her shawl around her shoulders, keeping her chin high. "We manage." Dalton's smile was like the glint of a blade. "Not for long. Taxes are due. Winter's coming. Folks are already whispering how a woman can't hold a place alone. Now, I can take that burden off you." Her heart thudded. She knew what he meant before he said it. "You'll marry me, Clara. Be respectable again, and in return your land stays safe. You say no, well, I can't promise your claim won't be swallowed up by someone with more authority." The children's eyes widened. Jacob's fists balled as though he could strike the lawman himself, but Clara gently pulled him close. Her throat tightened until it hurt to breathe. "You'd threaten a woman already widowed?" she managed. Dalton leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey. "Not a threat, darling, a chance. Think of your children. Think of yourself. My wedding band on your finger means food in their bellies and a roof over their heads. Without me..." He let the silence drag, letting her imagination do the work of his cruelty. When he finally left, the sound of his boots echoing down the dirt road, Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Annie climbed into her lap, her little arms wrapping tight around her neck. "Mama," Annie whispered, "do we have to?" Clara kissed the girl's hair, fighting tears. "No, baby, we don't have to. Not yet." But alone in the night, she could not help but wonder. How long before she had no choice at all? The town would not rise against its sheriff. And though Clara Mae's spirit burned with defiance, hunger and fear gnawed at her resolve. Still, a voice inside whispered, "Hold on, something's coming." And it was. If you're still in the saddle with them, tap like, subscribe, and ring the bell. This trail only gets wilder. The church bells tolled heavy that morning, their sound dragging Clara Mae like chains toward the altar. The whole town had gathered, men with folded arms, women whispering behind lace fans, children wide-eyed as if a spectacle were promised. It wasn't a wedding, it was a sentencing. Clara's dress was the same one she had worn when she married John. Its faded blue fabric had been carefully mended, but to her it felt like a betrayal, draped over her shoulders now in surrender. Jacob and Annie clung to her skirts, their faces pale as parchment. Every step she took down the aisle of the wooden chapel seemed to echo louder than the last, each one a step away from freedom. Sheriff Dalton stood waiting at the front, smug in his dark suit, his badge gleaming in the morning sun slanting through the windows. He tipped his hat mockingly as Clara approached, his smile stretching wide enough for the whole town to see. To him, this was conquest, not union. The preacher's voice shook as he began the ceremony, aware of the tension, aware of the fear in Clara's eyes. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared speak. After all, who would challenge the law? Clara's heart pounded. The words blurred in her ears, to have and to hold, to honor and obey. Her mouth felt sewn shut, but she could hear Annie sniffle at her side. Jacob tightened his grip on her hand, whispering, "Don't, Mama, please don't." The sheriff's fingers twitched near his gun belt, a subtle reminder of the power he carried. Clara looked out over the faces gathered. Neighbors, ranchers, shopkeepers, people who had watched her struggle, who pitied but never intervened. And now they watched her be handed over like cattle at auction. Her voice cracked the silence. The preacher hesitated, leaning forward. "Do you take this man?" The word lodged like a stone in her throat. Dalton leaned closer, his whisper sharp enough for only her to hear. "Say yes, or watch what happens to those young'uns." The church seemed to close in, the walls shrinking, the air growing heavy. Clara Mae's knees threatened to buckle. For a moment she prayed silently for a miracle, for some sign that she was not abandoned. And just as the preacher raised his hand to continue, the back doors of the chapel swung wide with a bang. A tall figure stepped in, silhouetted against the blinding light of the prairie sun. Dust clung to his long coat, his hat shadowing his face, but the steel of a revolver gleamed at his side. Every head turned. Whispers rippled like wildfire through the congregation. The stranger's boots struck the floorboards slow and deliberate, each step pulling the air taut as a bowstring. Clara Mae's breath caught. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. The stranger's presence filled the chapel like a storm rolling in. His coat was travel-worn, dust crusting its hem, and his hat brim shadowed a face etched with miles of trail and battles fought. But it was his eyes, flint gray, steady, that cut through the room, silencing the whispers. Sheriff Dalton bristled, his hand dropping instinctively to his revolver. "This is a private ceremony," he barked, though his voice wavered just enough to betray unease. The stranger's boots halted a few paces from the altar, his voice calm but commanding, carried to every corner of the wooden chapel. Looks to me like it ain't much of a ceremony, more like a cage being shut. Clara Mae's breath hitched. Jacob edged in front of his mother as if to guard her, though his small fists trembled. Annie clung tighter, her wide eyes locked on the man who dared to speak what no one else would. Dalton's smile was thin as wire. "You got no business here, Drifter. Step aside before you find yourself 6 feet under." The stranger tipped his hat back just enough for the townsfolk to see the scar running along his jaw, proof he had stood against death before and walked away. "My business," he said evenly, "is that no woman should be forced to say words she don't mean. Not today. Not ever." Gasps stirred the crowd. A few men exchanged glances, shame flickering in their eyes, but still no one moved to speak against their sheriff. Dalton's face flushed red. He jerked his revolver half from its holster. "One more word, and you'll be a corpse on my floor." The stranger's hand was already on his gun, the leather creak of his holster echoing like thunder. For a heartbeat, the whole church held, its breath, the weight of the showdown pressing heavy on every chest. "Go on, then," the drifter said, eyes locked on Dalton. "But know this, the minute you draw, you won't finish the motion." The preacher's voice trembled, breaking the tension. "Sheriff, please, God's house is no place for blood." Dalton sneered, but his hand faltered. The stranger had the look of a man who had nothing to lose, and that frightened him more than a bullet. The drifter shifted his gaze to Clara Mae, his tone softening. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this. Tell him yourself." Her lips trembled, but something inside her, long smothered, rose to the surface. She turned to the congregation, her voice firm. "I will not marry this man, not now, not ever." The crowd erupted in whispers, some in shock, some in approval. Dalton's face twisted in fury. "You'll regret this," he spat, but his hand finally dropped away from his gun. The stranger stepped closer, standing between Clara Mae and the sheriff, his stance wide, unyielding. "Not while I'm standing here, she won't." Ba-ba. The first time in months, Clara Mae felt her knees steady. The cage door had been flung open, and the choice at last was hers. The chapel emptied in uneasy silence, the townsfolk filing out like cattle spooked by thunder. Some dared to tip their hats toward Clara Mae, as though her defiance had woken something long buried in them. Others slunk away, too afraid of Dalton's wrath to show approval. Clara gathered her children close, her breath ragged, but her spirit burning brighter than it had in a year. Dalton stormed out the back, muttering promises of revenge, but for now, the fight was done. The drifter remained by her side, a steady presence as the last of the whispers faded into the prairie wind. On the church steps, sunlight spilled across his face, revealing more than the scar along his jaw. His eyes were not just steel, they held a quiet gentleness that surprised her, like a man who had known both violence and tenderness, and carried both with equal weight. "You risked your life back there," Clara said, her voice still shaky. The stranger adjusted his hat, shrugging, as though such things were small matters. "Ain't much of a life if a man can't stand up when standing's needed. Name's Luke McGraw. Been drifting a long while, but—" His gaze lingered on the children clutching her hands. "Some things are worth stopping for." Jacob straightened, eyes wide with admiration. "You stood up to the sheriff," he whispered, awe in his voice. Annie, shy, pressed a piece of her ribbon into Luke's hand, as though sealing some unspoken bond. Clara felt tears threaten. But this time they weren't born of fear. They were a release, the relief of knowing she wasn't alone anymore. Not truly. In the days that followed, Dalton tried bluster and threats, but the town had seen his cowardice. The sheriff's power waned, his grip loosened, and before long, Whispers turned against him. Clara's neighbors began showing up at her farm with small kindnesses. A sack of flour, help mending a fence, a bucket of water drawn from the well. It was as though her courage and the stranger's stand had awakened the better angels in them all. Luke stayed, at first offering only to fix her roof and chop her wood. But nights around the fire grew warmer with his stories. And Clara found herself smiling again, the children laughing at his dry humor. He never pressed her, never claimed her as Dalton had tried to. Instead, he carved a place with patience, with respect, with quiet acts of care that spoke louder than vows. One evening, as the prairie wind rustled through the wheat they had sown together, Clara turned to him. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she said softly, "but I'd be grateful if you'd stay in it." Luke's smile was small but sure. "Then tomorrow's worth waiting for." The widow's empty table was full again, not just with bread, but with laughter, with hope, with love that had been defended at gunpoint and then nurtured with gentleness. Out here on the frontier, survival had always been a battle. But Clara Mae had found something fiercer than fear, stronger than loneliness. She had found her home reborn. If Clara Mae's courage and heart touched something quiet and true inside your soul, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Out here in the Wild West, love may be hard won, but it's always worth the fight. Join us for more stories of grit, sacrifice, and hearts that endure against all odds.